Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Cain Ashby had spent years weaving lies, manipulating truths, and hiding behind carefully constructed facades, but the weight of his sins had finally caught up with him, pressing down on his chest like an immovable stone until he could no longer breathe under the suffocating guilt. And when the moment of reckoning finally arrived, he collapsed into it like a man drowning in his own conscience, standing in the dimly lit living room of the Chancellor Mansion with the echoes of betrayal whispering. In the shadows of the grand old house, his hands trembling as if the ghosts of his own choices were clawing at his skin, desperate to break free, the faces of those he had deceived, Lily, Jill, Billy, Devon, and countless others, flashed before his eyes in rapid succession, each one carrying its own unique blend of heartbreak, disappointment, and fury, and Cain realized with staggering clarity that the trail of destruction he had left behind could no longer be swept under the rug, no matter how hard he tried, no matter how many smooth words he used to charm his way out of consequence, because this was no longer about being clever or resourceful, this was about survival of the soul, a last-ditch effort to claw his way back from the abyss of moral collapse that threatened to swallow him whole. And with every breath that rasped from his lungs, Cain knew that if he did not come clean now, if he did not drag every secret into the unforgiving light of day, then he would be forever condemned to live in a prison of his own making, locked away by the very lies he once thought would set him free. And so, he opened his mouth and let the words pour out, words that burned his throat and sliced at his tongue, words that tasted like ash and regret as he confessed to the forgeries, the manipulations, the financial crimes, the betrayals both intimate and corporate, the twisted games he had played with wills and inheritances, the deceitful schemes he had used to elevate himself while others suffered, his role in Colin's schemes, his exploitation of Jill's trust, his deliberate concealment of truths from Lily, his lies to his children, his broken promises to friends and allies alike, each revelation spilling from him with the force of a dam bursting after decades of strain. And he could see it in their eyes, the horror, the disgust, the rage, as the truth landed like shards of glass at their feet, cutting through the last fragile bonds that tethered him to their forgiveness. Yet even in that storm of righteous fury, Cain dropped to his knees, his voice breaking into ragged sobs as he begged, not with the arrogance of a man used to talking his way out of trouble, but with the desperation of a shattered soul staring into the abyss of eternal exile. His words tumbling over one another in a frantic litany of "I'm sorry, I was wrong, I can't take it back, but please, please, forgive me," and his tears blurred the floor beneath him, soaking into the polished wood as his hands clutched at the empty air, as though trying to grab hold of redemption before it slipped away forever. And for a moment, silence swallowed the room, the kind of silence so heavy it felt like the world itself had stopped spinning, until Lily's voice, sharp and trembling with a cocktail of heartbreak and fury, cut through the suffocating stillness, demanding how he could have stood beside her for years, looked into her eyes, promised her love and loyalty, while carrying the poison of lies in his chest, and Jill's voice followed, booming with betrayal, demanding how he could have dared to take advantage of her trust and her legacy, how he could forge Colin's will and desecrate the family name she had worked a lifetime to protect. And Devon, standing off to the side with his arms crossed tight against his chest, his expression carved from stone, asked in a quiet but devastating tone how many lives Cain had ruined in pursuit of his own selfish needs, how many chances he thought he deserved after years of taking advantage of their compassion. And though every word felt like a blade slicing through his already shattered heart, Cain bowed his head lower, unable to meet their eyes, his voice trembling with confession after confession, his soul stripped bare for them to see. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to manipulate, wasn't trying to win, wasn't trying to charm, he was simply admitting that he was broken, that he had chosen wrong time and time again, that he had failed not only as a husband, as a son, and as a friend, but as a man, and that without their forgiveness, he feared there was nothing left of him worth saving. And the room spun with the enormity of the moment, each person wrestling with the desire for justice and the faint whisper of mercy, torn between the deep scars his actions had left and the faint glimmer of humanity now flickering in the hollow shell of the man they once thought they knew. And in that terrible tension, where every breath seemed to hang suspended in uncertainty, Cain continued to beg, his hands pressed together in supplication, his voice hoarse, his tears endless, each syllable a plea for one final chance to be better, to rebuild, to crawl his way back from the wreckage of his sins, even as the crushing weight of doubt and fury threatened to bury him where he knelt, and it became achingly clear that no matter what answer he received, whether forgiveness or permanent exile, this was a turning point that would define not only Cain's future, but the future of everyone whose lives had been entangled in his web of lies, because a confession of this magnitude could never be unheard, could never be undone, and in the end, all that remained was the raw, naked truth of a man who had lost everything and still dared to hope, against all odds, that redemption might somehow be possible, if only someone, anyone, would believe that he could change. The room was thick with tension, the air practically vibrating with anger, disbelief, and the fragile, almost imperceptible thread of pity that none of them wanted to acknowledge but couldn't entirely ignore, and Cain's voice, cracked and desperate, continued to spill forth, weaving a tapestry of confessions that exposed every deceit, every betrayal, every selfish act he had committed over the years, and as he spoke, Lily's eyes narrowed, shimmering with unshed tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. Her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides as she tried to steady herself, tried to find the words that would adequately convey the storm of emotions raging inside her, anger, heartbreak, confusion, disbelief, and yet, no words seemed sufficient, no retort sharp enough to match the enormity of the revelations that Cain laid bare before them, and Jill, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, paced like a predator, her steps sharp and deliberate, the click of her heels echoing through the cavernous living room as she demanded explanations, demanded accountability, each question punctuated by a shuddering breath that betrayed her own vulnerability beneath the veneer of control, while Devon, stoic as ever but with his jaw tight and his fists clenched at his sides, stood almost as a silent judge, his piercing gaze never leaving Cain, weighing each word, calculating the depth of his remorse, and silently debating whether such remorse could ever erase the trail of devastation left in Cain's wake, and Billy, who had walked in moments earlier after hearing the commotion, froze in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock as he took in the scene, his mind struggling to reconcile the man kneeling, broken and tear-streaked, with the man who had manipulated, lied, and caused so much harm over the years, and the silence between confessions became almost unbearable, a physical force pressing on everyone's chests, until Cain, his voice nearly a whisper now, admitted his most shameful acts, the ones he had buried deepest even from himself, the acts that had corroded the very core of his being, and with each admission, the room seemed to grow colder, the walls tighter, the air heavier, as if the house itself mourned the moral decay that had taken root within its walls. And then came the memories, the haunting, vivid recollections of moments Cain had tried to erase, moments that now seemed impossibly permanent, flashing before everyone's eyes as if projected by some merciless projector that refused to blink, refused to let anyone look away, the forged documents, the manipulated wills, the private lies whispered into ears meant to be trusted, the manipulations of family dynamics for personal gain, the betrayals of friendships nurtured over years, the subtle but poisonous undermining of trust between those who had counted on him, the secret meetings, the deceptions layered so intricately that even he sometimes forgot where one lie ended and another began, and it was all unraveling now, frayed threads laid bare, leaving everyone exposed to the raw, bleeding truth of a man who had lost the map to his own morality and had wandered, knowingly and recklessly, into a dark abyss from which he now begged to be rescued, begged to be forgiven, begged for a chance that seemed, in that moment, impossibly distant, if not entirely lost. Lily, standing rigid, her fingers twitching as though she might reach out to strike him or collapse to the floor, finally spoke, her voice breaking under the weight of all she had been holding in. She asked him how he could have betrayed not just her, but their children, their family, the very foundation of trust they had built together, how he could have lied to her every time she looked at him with hope in her eyes. How he could have manipulated situations to his advantage while she bore the emotional consequences, and Cain's head bowed lower, his tears falling freely now, each one a confession, each one a plea, as he whispered that he knew he didn't deserve any forgiveness, that he had destroyed his own life by choosing lies over love, convenience over honesty, selfishness over loyalty, and yet, he couldn't stop himself from asking, nearly begging, for a chance to make things right. For a moment, a day, a lifetime, where he might prove that he could be the man he had always promised to be but never truly was, and Jill, who had been pacing like a caged animal, now halted, placing her hands on her hips, her chest heaving with anger and hurt, demanding to know why Cain had thought himself above accountability, why he had assumed that clever manipulation could buy him another chance at life, love, and legacy, why he had gambled with people's lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard, and Cain's voice, barely audible over the storm of emotion swirling around him, trembled as he admitted that he had been foolish, arrogant, and deeply, irreparably broken, that he had been driven by fear, greed, and pride, and that he was terrified of the emptiness left behind, the consequences he could not reverse, the pain he had caused, the trust he had shattered, and in that moment, Devon stepped forward, his posture firm, his expression unyielding, and asked the question that had lingered in the air for so long, the question none of them had dared speak aloud, yet all had thought. How could they ever trust him again? How could they ever believe that he had truly changed? And Cain, tears streaming, hands pressed together and pleading, whispered that he didn't know if they could, that he understood if they never forgave him, that he would live with the consequences forever, and that he only asked, begged, for the chance to prove that he could be worthy of redemption, worthy of their trust, worthy of love, even if that day never came. The room was suffused with grief, rage, and disbelief, a cauldron of emotions that threatened to boil over at any second, as each person struggled to reconcile the man before them with the actions that had brought them here, and the silence that followed was deafening, heavy with the weight of decisions yet to be made, judgments yet to be passed, and futures that could never be untangled from the mess Cain had created, while outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself mourned, or perhaps condemned, the human frailty laid bare within the walls of the mansion, and Cain, his body shaking from exhaustion, remorse, and the enormity of the moment, sank further to the floor, unable to stand, unable to speak, only able to weep, only able to hope, and the others, though filled with anger and pain, could not entirely shut out the raw vulnerability, the genuine despair, the desperate plea for a second chance that radiated from him, because even the most wounded hearts sometimes recognize the flicker of sincerity, even in those who have hurt them the most, and so, for the first time in years, the room seemed to hold its collective breath, poised on the knife edge between retribution and compassion, between justice and forgiveness, between ending a chapter with fury and opening a new one with cautious hope, and Cain's final words, barely audible, carried a weight that seemed to settle on everyone's shoulders, that he was sorry, that he knew he was guilty, that he accepted the consequences, that he begged for forgiveness, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends, and in that confession, in that raw, unfiltered truth, the seeds of a future, uncertain, fragile, and fraught with risk, were planted, though whether they would grow into redemption, or be choked out by anger and mistrust, remained to be seen. Cain's confession hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through the grand hallways of the Chancellor Mansion and rattling the very foundations of the lives he had touched, each word landing with a weight that seemed almost unbearable. And yet he could not stop himself, could not contain the torrent of truth that had been years in the making, spilling out with the force of a river breaking through a dam, and as the words echoed, the faces around him twisted with conflicting emotions. Lily, her eyes brimming with tears, alternated between disbelief, fury, and a desperate longing to find a fragment of the man she had once loved, a man she had trusted with her heart and the future of their children, her hands trembling as she struggled to steady herself, wanting to scream, to run, to lash out, to demand justice, yet part of her could not ignore the raw, exposed humanity now standing before her, a man stripped bare of pretense, vulnerable in a way that was almost unbearable to witness. Jill, her fury a living, breathing entity, stalked the room like a hawk circling its prey, every step echoing off the walls as she demanded accountability, a reckoning that Cain had no choice but to face, the weight of her disappointment almost palpable, a tangible force pressing down on him, and every confession he made was met with stinging questions, sharp as knives, each one cutting through the thin veil of self-justification he had once relied on, forcing him to confront the magnitude of his sins, the way he had manipulated, deceived, and broken those closest to him for his own gain, and Devon, standing slightly apart yet every bit as judgmental, felt a mixture of sorrow and anger that left him almost paralyzed, a man who had once believed in Kane's potential now forced to weigh whether the remnants of his integrity could ever outweigh the havoc he had wreaked, while Billy, arriving in stunned silence just moments earlier, now wrestled with a mixture of disbelief and outrage, unable to reconcile the man kneeling before him, drenched in tears and brokenness, with the man who had so consistently manipulated his life, his family, and his trust for selfish ends, and Kane, sensing the magnitude of the moment, could barely hold himself upright, his voice hoarse and trembling as he continued his litany of admissions, each one more painful to say than the last, as if voicing them out loud would somehow atone for the years of pain he had inflicted, yet deep down he knew words alone could never repair what had been destroyed, and he was left clutching at the fragile hope that perhaps, somehow, forgiveness might still be within reach, even if it required decades of penance to achieve, even if it demanded sacrifices he had yet to comprehend. The emotional tension in the room was almost suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations, barely suppressed rage, and the fragile flicker of empathy that refused to be extinguished entirely, as each person processed the enormity of Kane's revelations, the manipulations of family trust, the careful orchestration of events that had caused financial ruin, heartbreak, and betrayal, the will forgery, the secret dealings, the lies told to shield himself while exposing others to suffering. The betrayals that cut the deepest because they had come from someone who had been trusted, loved, and relied upon, and yet, despite the litany of sins, there remained a certain undeniable humanity in Kane's posture, in the way he trembled, in the raw desperation etched into every line of his face, in the way his voice broke repeatedly as he begged, almost incoherently, for one last chance to prove that he could be better, to make amends, to claw his way back from the moral abyss into which he had fallen, and for a fleeting moment, even Jill faltered, the fire in her eyes dimming slightly as she glimpsed the depth of his remorse, the tangible anguish that he carried like a wound too deep to be ignored, and Lily's tears fell freely now, the emotional dam finally giving way as grief mingled with anger, a complex, painful mixture of emotions that left her voice trembling as she asked him how he could have betrayed not just her, but their children, how he could have twisted the very foundation of their family for his own selfish gain, and Kane, head bowed, shoulders shaking violently, whispered that he did not know, that he could not explain it except to admit that he had been weak, foolish, and driven by impulses that had left a trail of devastation, that he had been blinded by pride, fear, and desperation, and that he now understood the consequences of every action, every lie, every manipulation, and that he was willing to accept any punishment, any estrangement, any penance necessary to attempt to make right what had been broken. The room seemed suspended in a strange, almost surreal state, each second stretching into eternity as the weight of Kane's confession settled over everyone like a storm cloud refusing to pass, and in that moment, the emotional toll was nearly unbearable. Memories of past betrayals flashed before everyone's eyes like shards of shattered glass, cutting through the fragile veneer of civility, each recollection bringing with it fresh anger, grief, and a painful recognition that their lives had been irrevocably altered by the man who now lay prostrate before them, and yet, even as the room teetered between fury and disbelief, a faint glimmer of the possibility of redemption began to emerge, tenuous and fragile, like the first light of dawn breaking over a storm-ravaged landscape, a whisper that perhaps, in time, the human heart could forgive even the gravest of transgressions, if only it was met with genuine contrition, sustained effort, and a commitment to change that was more than mere words. Kane, sensing this subtle shift, continued, his voice barely audible yet carrying the weight of his soul, recounting the moments where he had chosen deception over honesty, manipulation over empathy, personal gain over the well-being of those he loved, and with every admission, the room reacted, the people within it struggling to process the enormity of what was being revealed. Lily, sobbing quietly now, pressed a hand to her mouth, torn between the impulse to turn away and the desire to witness every word, to ensure that nothing was left unspoken, to see the full scope of the man who had so profoundly affected their lives. Jill, rigid but listening intently, the edges of her anger fraying just enough to glimpse the sincerity of his remorse, the recognition that this was not a performance, not a manipulation, but the unvarnished truth of a man who had reached the brink of despair and could no longer carry the burden of secrecy. Devon, still stern, still evaluating, but with a glimmer of understanding, recognizing that Kane's admissions, while devastating, were also a rare acknowledgement of fault and a first step toward potential redemption, and Billy, torn between disbelief and a flicker of reluctant empathy, wrestled with his own sense of justice, trying to balance the urge to punish with the recognition that genuine remorse was not easily faked, that the vulnerability before him could not be ignored, that the human heart, even when wounded, sometimes recognized the potential for change.